As you tune in today, I recognize many of us are on a personal journey, delving into self-discovery, exploring communities of the underrepresented, and navigating the vast landscape of mental health. Some are even embarking on the courageous path of cultivating and practicing cultural humility and competence. And to each and every listener, supporter, and guest speaker who have graced this podcast, my deepest gratitude. Today's episode delves deep, tackling a weighty subject that resonates deeply with the American Arab, Middle Eastern, and North African communities, which is the ongoing conflict in Palestine. It's an honor to be joined by Dr. Khaghani, the Advocacy Committee Co-Chair from the American Arab, Middle Eastern, and North African Psychological Association, as we navigate this crucial topic. So here is our conversation. Contextualizing the history and impact of violence that is happening against Palestinian people is essential if we truly want to align with humanity. Due to what we know about generational trauma, there are many American Arab, Middle Eastern, and North African psychologists and mental health providers that are being affected. Also, did you know that the impact is affecting many communities and mental health professionals of color, especially those who have shared histories due to the consequences of colonization and displacement? So how do we show up for each other or as allies? How do we fight against oppressive narratives so that AMENA peoples can construct their own visibility and thus be empowered? Welcome to People of Color in Psychology, the show that explores mental health topics specific to culture, diversity, and communities of color. I am your host, Jack Zen. Our guest today is Dr. Khaghani. She is a licensed clinical psychologist, the Advocacy Committee Co-Chair for American Arab, Middle Eastern, and North African Psychological Association. She also has a private practice in San Francisco. Dr. Khaghani has a joint PhD in American Studies and African American Studies from Yale University, and a PsyD from the California School of Professional Psychology in San Francisco. As a Middle Eastern and North African psychologist and Advocacy Committee Co-Chair for AMENA-Psy, Dr. Khaghani will be raising awareness relevant to the AMENA psychologist and student community. She will also be sharing guidelines for working with and supporting AMENA-identified students and professionals. Dr. Khaghani, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for inviting me on. I really appreciate the work that you're doing, and I think it raises awareness across communities. I have learned so much from your podcast, so I feel really honored to be in your company and the company of so many distinguished guests. So thank you so much on behalf of myself and AMENA-Psy.
Thank you very much for that feedback and encouragement. And can you walk us through your personal journey? Share with us any memorable events and circumstances that may have influenced how you got into this work.
I'm happy to do so. Thank you for asking. Well, my journey has been a bit varied because I started out in a different field. It started out in American Studies and African American Studies, as you noted, which is an interdisciplinary field, but probably most people would identify me as a historian, and I feel comfortable with that identification. And I started studying those issues pertaining really to racial formation and colonialism, and I did a lot of my research on anti-colonial Black and MENA, anti-colonial intellectuals in the first half of the 20th century. And that work actually came out of my own personal experience. I grew up in suburban Detroit. In the second half of my childhood was spent in a pretty homogenous place that was really elitist and racist and homophobic and misogynistic, all of those isms. And it was really traumatizing for me. And when coming out of that experience, of course, my family thought they were giving me the best educational opportunities. And there were some good opportunities I got from it. I don't want to discount those. But it wasn't until I was an undergraduate at the University of Michigan, started emerging and thinking about what I had gone through, and that sort of the pain and the suffering that I went through, and not just me, but other people, unfortunately, who had to go through that experience as well. I think it really informed my path moving forward. So first I studied kind of a lot of these issues at a historical level. And then when I got to the end of my degree, of my PhD, I realized, hey, I really want to work with people one-on-one. I don't want to just throwing no shade at historians, because I think they do amazing work, but it felt isolating for me. And what I hearkened back to, and the things and experiences I appreciated the most from graduate school, and there were many because I came from a wonderful community of scholars and was really shaped by them. What I enjoyed the most was working with my undergraduates in the ethnic studies, in which I got to know their life stories and their narratives one-on-one. And I got to mentor them and support them. And I realized that that's sort of what I wanted to do. So that led me down the path of psychology. And I really consider what I do today, both in training future clinical psychologists, and I work with a lot of college students myself as a clinician, as well as children and older adults, but is that I feel like I'm helping people and sort of maybe a guide. I'm accompanying them on their journey to sort of rediscovering and retelling their own life narrative. So I feel like that thread of history is still running through what I do. And I also think a lot about the connections between interiority, internal experience, and external experience. So I really try to bring together both. So that's what has brought me to where I am today in
Wow.
terms of my professional path.
Wow. Frankly, it's interesting. You are definitely well positioned to talk about some of the social issues that are going on. In fact, as many of us have gone through graduate training, it's almost as though we're working backwards. Now we're looking into the history. If we really want to think about cultural humility, culturally informed clinical practice, it requires us to understand the history. You already have that experience under your belt. And so, one of the main reasons we have you here on this particular episode is to bring awareness to the AMENA-Psy community. And one of the things we talked about too is this idea of visibility. How would the AMENA-Psy like to reframe the community's visibility? Can you give us some specific examples?
Thank you so much, Jack. I really appreciate this question because it is so central to the work that we do and we hope to continue doing as an organization. So, presently, and I think if you're watching the news, there is a certain amount of visibility of MENA people, right? But it's not just any visibility. We're really trying to reframe that, as you mentioned. So one of the unfortunate experiences of MENA peoples is that what oftentimes distinguishes our experience in the West in many respects, and sadly back in our region of origin, as well as the ongoing Western military involvement in the Middle East and North Africa. So growing up here, MENA people, whether we choose to or not, are almost constantly forced to negotiate our identities and our experiences in light of whatever conflict or war or invasion is occurring in the Middle East and North Africa at any given time. So that's evident, obviously, at this moment around Palestine, for example. And even the name itself of the region, Middle East and North Africa, is constructed in many respects out of a geopolitical history rooted in colonialism, which is why some folks prefer to use the term WANA or Southwest Asia and North Africa when discussing the MENA region and its people, be it AMENA-Psy use MENA, but we're certainly very familiar with a lot of activist groups who use WANA. So I wanted to kind of name that so people don't get confused. So that's when we consider raising the visibility of MENA peoples and AMENA-Psy, which is one of our objectives as an organization. We're speaking, as I mentioned, it's about a specific form of visibility. And indeed, much of our work on the advocacy committee for AMENA-Psy is really thinking about the role of diversity in our community, both in terms of ethnic diversity. So while, Arabs form a large percentage of our community, there's also many other communities, including Turkish people, Persians, Armenians, Coptics, Assyrians, Amazighs. There's Black MENA communities and even nomadic minorities like the Qashqai, which happens to be my own ethnic lineage from Iran. And these are just a few. And there's also incredible religious diversity in the region, including Christians, Muslims, Jews, as well as Baha'is, Zoroastrians, Druze, etc. So although many MENA people are oftentimes mischaracterized as only being Muslim, the historical truth is that even, and speaking of Islam, which is the religion I practice, the faith itself arose in a broader kind of diverse religious context. And I really highlight that because when we're thinking about the visibility of the region, we also want to think, as you mentioned, historically. And sometimes present day events, people use those to stand in for a long-standing history, and we want to correct that around visibility in AMENA-Psy. So, for example, people often think about the region as a place where people from different faith traditions and different ethnicities were never able to coexist. And as I'm noting, that assumption is historically inaccurate. And in fact, people from different faith traditions have a long history of coexistence and a rich cultural dialogue and exchange. And many of us would argue that actually it's more of a Western history that if one looks into it, we see this history of exclusivity and the expulsion of people from non-Christian faith from Europe, for example, whether we're talking about Muslims and Jews from late medieval Spain or obviously, the great tragedy of the extermination of millions of Jews during the Holocaust. So we want to really be really clear, not to say that this is a region where everything has always been perfect. I don't think that exists on this earth, but we wanted to really be specific around history and historicity when we're thinking about visibility in the region. So, of course, things have shifted with the advent of the Western colonial project and with nationalism and the exclusivity tied to that. But when we think about MENA peoples and the MENA region, I really like to highlight, again, the rich multicultural and multi-faith traditions. And I would say that this historical memory and experience is really woven into the fabric of the region, whether we're discussing food or language, art forms, faith practices, and political traditions and governance, and it's in our DNA. So it's one of the things I'm most proud of as a MENA woman, and one that I always hold up as a former historian of the region and a person who remains really deeply tied to the region and its people today. And sorry to go on so long, but I do want to add one additional piece, which is that when we're thinking about this focus on visibility as an organization, and I would include myself as a person who's thinking about these issues quite a bit as well, we're thinking about visibility, an additional role that it plays in terms of bringing visibility and a specifically historically grounded visibility around diversity to MENA peoples and to our regions. We are participating in a broader decolonial struggle for justice against forces that have really tried to kind of shrink us down in racist and dehumanizing ways. So we're drawing a lot, at the organization. We're having these conversations in our board meetings and whatnot, and really thinking a lot about, post-colonial studies and our kind of decolonial forebears. I would name the work of the Palestinian intellectual Edward Said, but he has this really, really important work called Orientalism, which really lays out how MENA communities have been viewed over time and the historical reasons behind the particular lens through which we have been understood. And he explains how the idea of the Orient as other has been critical to the modern Western self-fashioning and fantasy of itself, one might say even psychology. And so in raising the historically and culturally grounded visibility of MENA communities, we at AMENA-Psy are participating, we believe, in a long-standing decolonial struggle that reaches far beyond the boundaries of our political region and really thinks about decolonial struggle and decolonial psychology through a much broader lens.
It's like you're having to recreate your visibility because essentially it's been tainted by issues of the colonial struggles and racism. Also, one thing we've talked about, which is you don't necessarily have I would say, a pure identity or pure visibility. It's always in context of the horrors, in context of, say, war and so forth, as opposed to rich fabric of cultural practices. And as you were talking about being a MENA individual, I saw the light, the brightness, and there's a celebration of identity. And I would love for the world to see more of that. Is there anything else you want to share with us regarding efforts or ideas relating to reframing the community's visibility for other AMENA psychologists and students?
Thank you so much, Jack. I really appreciate you raising that. We have been engaging, in lots of efforts as an organization around raising our visibility. And one of the pieces that one of the campaigns we have participated in that we initiated is the, hashtag We Are MENA campaign that took place a year or so ago and it's ongoing, in which we have sought to educate the broader public and psychology circles that serve the public about who we are as people and inform others about our experiences, our contributions. And part of this is just letting folks know what countries and peoples are part of the MENA region, which includes all of the North African countries and the Middle East, so countries across, the Levant, Turkey, Armenia, Iran, the Arabian Peninsula. But a large part is also about uplifting MENA and distinguishing us from the white category in which we have been kind of dropped into that box. And our racialized and colonized experience is not commensurate with this categorization. And so another piece around raising our visibility is the work that our president, Gigi Awad, for example, has done with regard to getting the census to reflect our racialized experience by including the MENA racial box, which, this is something that's coming. We're very excited to say, and this is going to allow us to further enhance our visibility. We'll be able to be accurately counted demographically and more importantly, studied in terms of the research, and more positive interventions can hopefully be developed. And then as an individual who trains clinical psychology students, this information will help us, drive curriculum development, both in psychology departments and in training programs. And this is going to, in turn, of course, hopefully help the MENA people who are seeking our services, which is really the key piece. And of course, then there's the piece around anti-stigmatization around the mental health component that also, is something that gets addressed through raising our visibility. So I think these are the big pieces that I would really like to highlight when we're thinking about the actions that we're engaged in. I think one other piece I would say is that even by highlighting this piece around visibility, I think it really underscores the values of our organization, which are really near and dear to my heart, in that we aren't just thinking about individuals and their psychological experience as something that's happening within them. We are really thinking critically about external circumstances, histories, political and sociological circumstances, cultural circumstances, and the role that plays as well. So we're looking at both the internal and the external. And I think this is something that we are engaged in, a part, again, of thinking a more decolonial approach to the field that other BIPOC psychologists I know that you had on your own program are also, deeply engaged in and working on both, at organizational level, at the APA, and on the personal level, and in all different kind of local communities. So we're thinking a lot about these issues and just, again, linking the internal and the external We're also thinking, when we're raising about visibility, this the idea of transgenerational trauma, which I know that you're, of course, very familiar with, something that is unfortunately something that shaped a lot of the experiences of communities of color. So these are all pieces that really come into play when we're thinking about issues of visibility and the different steps that we're taking as an organization around raising visibility of our community.
Wow, that's just a lot of work, a lot of groundwork y'all are really spearheading here. And, one thing that I'm also thinking about too, in terms of culturally informed practice, as we are embarking a personal journey of developing our cultural competence. Can you share with me what is one or two core components of a culturally informed curriculum in working with AMENA populations?
Well, this is really a great, great question. And I want to thank you for raising it because it's one that's very close to my heart. In the advocacy committee of AMENA-Psy, we worked across the organization with other committees, such as the research and the practice committee, and of course the board, around this issue of developing a curriculum. Because I don't know about you, Jack, but when I was going through graduate school, there was basically, I think, like one sentence about MENA individuals, and that all got categorized under Arab, which it's definitely a large percentage of MENA people, as I mentioned, but it's not all MENA people. And even at that sentence was not even accurate. It basically said when you're doing therapy with an Arab individual, and of course they made the assumption that that person being Arab meant that they were absolutely Muslim, which we know is not the case. I mean, there are many Muslims, but there's also many other religious communities in the region. And they said, don't look this person in the eye. And that was the takeaway.
Oh, gosh.
Yes. And I was absolutely floored that this was all people coming through this graduate psychology program were learning about the community that I hold so near and dear to my heart. And of course, there was little space for me to address it. I raised it in class, but who knows what impact that had. And that, those textbooks weren't all of a sudden changed out. But part of my objective personally, and something I do as a clinical supervisor and person who's involved in a training program, and on AMENA-Psy, is to try to correct it. So we have been in the process, and it's an ongoing process, and working with folks from other organizations as well has really benefited other organizations to this end, is developing this curriculum. So one of the components, as I highlighted, really pertains to issues of visibility and history. So who we are, what has been our historical experience, and, of course, highlighting the role of trauma and transgenerational trauma, which sadly has shaped us. And I would say through meaning making, there's that post-traumatic growth, which I think is also really important and valuable and something that I hold close to my own heart. So this idea that through a greater understanding of who we are, including our cultural and religious diversity, psychologists can better contextualize us as people and as clients, and therefore serve our community in better and more fruitful and more valuable ways. And the second component of the curriculum would have to be around understanding our racialized experience, our racial trauma, speaking back to trauma, as I mentioned. And there's a really important article that I would really recommend folks, even without a curriculum developed at hand, if they're wanting to learn more about our experience. It appeared in the American Psychologist, and it's by Doctors Mona Amir, Gigi Awad, and Mariam Kia Keating. And it's entitled A Model of Cumulative Racial Ethnic Trauma Among Americans of Middle Eastern and North African Descent. So that's a good place to start. And so in understanding our racialized experience or racial trauma, we would need to think a lot about in this curriculum how we have been racialized historically. And hopefully it would encourage those learning about us not only to better appreciate our experiences of marginalization, which is in and of itself important, but also to question racial constructions overall and to explore more deeply the history of racism over time, as well as colonialism, and the tremendous and deleterious impact it's had not only on MENA peoples, but on other racialized and colonized peoples and humanity in general. So for me, it's always, even thinking larger and larger, yes, it's important about our communities, but we're not unique.
Yeah, this is all
I would say
interrelated.
sadly, very much so.
Yeah.
Very much so.
Dr. Khaghani, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts and also your personal experience. In fact, I had a reaction when you described reading that passage in a psychology textbook. The first thing you read was, don't look them in the eye. I'm curious, do you recall how you felt when you read that?
I was pretty outraged. It's one of those things where if you don't laugh, you cry kind of thing. And so I was just so flabbergasted. I happened to be, I was very, very lucky in my program, which is very unique, that I happened to land in a group, a very tight-knit group of other MENA and South Asian colleagues or friends. And so we were able to exchange, around this and just feel like, how could this be? How could this be? And yeah, I was outraged. I understand where they're getting it. I understand that they pulled a thread. I don't think that when it was in the book, the intention, of course, there's intention versus impact. I think the intention was probably quite good, trying to be culturally sensitive, but it was just a lack of knowledge. And unfortunately, that has exponential effects. And it did feel objectifying. It felt really reductive. And, I think I can speak personally as a MENA woman. One of the things I love to share about my culture, and I'm a mother, so I think my children know this very well, is there's so much warmth. In Persian, we have so many different ways of expressing our love for each other. We're a culture that kisses people on both cheeks, sometimes multiple times when we are greeting each other. So the fact that there's like this real standoffish vibe that sentence communicated, this idea of keeping your distance, this idea around safety or lack thereof, just lies in the face of my experience. And it's one of the reasons why I work so diligently, as a mother with my own children, to reframe and reorient them to understand their culture, our culture in different ways. And I'm always talking about it and spreading it with others. So I try to take the advocacy work into my daily life as well. But it's all about that. To me, it's a culture of closeness, a culture of connection, of deep, deep friendships and family relationships versus one of distance and standoffishness and fear, which unfortunately is, again, how we've been dehumanized. And that way of dehumanizing us, of holding us at a distance, sadly allows people to commit violence against us, as we're seeing right now going on in Palestine and Gaza, and in the US, if you know about, unfortunately, the recent shootings of the Palestinian college students and other hate crimes that are running rampant.
Yeah, I definitely felt the anger when, even from you citing that, and it's amazing because the impact that you were saying, it's a textbook. You weren't the only one reading it. Many people are reading it. So, but my hope is that having a conversation about this is to really elucidate important issues and how to correct our curriculum. how to continue to grow and acknowledge, as you were saying, from a place of understanding that there's a lack of knowledge. Okay, now we're providing some knowledge. How do we grow from there? And I do hope that many folks who are teaching multicultural counseling and psychology, that they actually list AMENA-Psy as a resource on the syllabus. So with that, kind of going back to the curriculum, one of the things I reviewed is the AMENA-Psy's recommendations. These are fantastic recommendations. And there was one that I just take for granted. And this is the one where you talked about flexibility and accommodations for students, and possibly thinking about colleagues too when you're working with colleagues. And there was one thing about, as students are collecting data within the AMENA community, how that data collection can be halted due to the cultural norms of honor and respect when folks are mourning the death of family members and communities. These are things that we don't even think about. And so, in line with curriculum development and creating a holistic environment to facilitate growth and thriving of students and professionals who identify as the AMENA community, can you share with me these additional curriculums or recommendations?
First, I wanted to thank you for all that you shared, Jack, and for encouraging folks to come to AMENA-Psy for that. And we have some webinars posted. We have a number of statements published. We're working on more resources right now around supporting children through all of the violence that they are witnessing that's being directed against MENA peoples. So just wanting to kind of encourage folks to that end and appreciate your encouragement. I think, one of the pieces I would really like to highlight is on the role of self-education, because this is something that I was kind of speaking to earlier. And I think it's really important, whenever we're working with people with different cultural experiences or just different life experiences, ethically as psychologists, there is an expectation that we are supposed to educate ourselves. And that is so important. And I think actually one of the most wonderful things about our field, because it's like constant growth, constant development and expansion. So I sort of feel like as individuals, we're really lucky to be in this field. And so, directing folks to, if you come to the AMENA-Psy.org website, we can offer you some resources around education. And again, pointing to the diversity of our communities. And I wanted to highlight this piece around folks. I think because of what is presented in the media around us, there's this idea of, all of the issues that MENA peoples are facing, they're just too complicated, too complex, and people just kind of throw up their hand. I can't handle, they're overwhelmed. One of the things we're trying to disabuse people of, one of the notions, is that it's not so complex. It's not so complex. It's not outside of their scope. Some of the issues are very, very kind of basic around human experience, human rights, whatnot. So educate oneself, and one doesn't have to be a quote unquote expert. There's never a sense, as we know, practicing cultural humility. We're never going to know it all. I myself as a MENA individual am not an expert on every single MENA person's experience. I like to be an expert on my own, but sometimes I wonder about that. But that said, to be an ally, to be able to do this work, you yourself have worked with MENA clients, one has to just remain open and curious, sensitive, compassionate, humble, and looking to learn, but not necessarily, hey, I have to be an expert or I can't do the work. So I think that self-education is really important. And I feel like they're all pretty linked, but this idea of acknowledging a person's reality and taking steps to reduce harm is really, really important, especially in times that we unfortunately are currently living in. And I should currently living in. And I should say that these guidelines came up because we've heard a lot from our MENA students about what they're experiencing right now. And it's a very difficult time within our communities. So making space to hear people's experiences and then doing what we can do to sort of mitigate harm. Of course, we can't take a history of trauma away from somebody. And actually, as we're talking about post-traumatic growth, my own history of trauma is what's made me who I am today. So I don't want to say erase it, right? I want to take the meaning from it. But we can, be compassionate. We can listen and learn from people. We can make space. We can be considerate around, as you shared earlier, around making space if they need to grieve whatever that they're currently experiencing. Not, dialing up on the pressure on people, creating a sense of safety where, whether it's in classes or, in supervision, that people feel they can come and share their personal experience. And then, being really, really thoughtful about, as a supervisor, about our positions of power and really thinking about how that impacts, again, thinking intent versus impact. I may have the best intentions, but, I'm not in this other person's shoes. So really checking in with the people we're supervising and seeing, hey, how did this land with you? I know this, again, speaking as a mother, there's so many times I say things and my daughter will say, hey, mom, you said it this way, and I'm like, hey, I didn't think that I said it like that. But I realized her experience of what I said is very different than my intention. So then there's the room for repair. So there's always room for repair. And I think as psychologists, this is a big part of our work. So those are just some of the different pieces that I would highlight from our guidelines.
All right, Dr. Khaghani, I know that you have a joint PhD in American Studies and African American Studies from Yale University. So this really actually provides a lot of insight from your knowledge in terms of the conflict and issues that are happening right now. If it is okay with you, I'd like to shift gears to talk about the impact on AMENA community with what is happening in Palestine.
Thank you so much, Jack. Again, I just want to thank you for the space that you're providing me and AMENA-Psy to talk and share about these very important issues. And there is something I would like to speak to a little bit more directly. And that is with regard to one of the broader contextual pieces around our meeting today, as it pertains to MENA communities, and in particular, our Palestinian siblings. And that is, of course, the war in Palestine, and specifically the genocide in Gaza. I want to state right from the outset that even in speaking to these issues, I'm using terminology that many individuals find highly disturbing. And there is a lot of pressure and an active campaign of sorts to silence anyone who speaks to the level of violence committed against Palestinians in Gaza. Indeed, I should just state that many MENA students, academics, professionals, Palestinians and non-Palestinians alike, and their allies have actually been doxxed and lost jobs and opportunities and positions on account of their unwillingness to remain silent on this critical issue. So the campaign against speaking about the realities of Palestinians' experience in general has been ongoing and hasn't entirely been limited to this particular event, violence, I should state, but it's been ongoing for many years. And it's also affected many of our BIPOC cousins who have bravely stood strong alongside Palestinian and MENA communities on this issue. So right from the outset, I want to thank you personally, Jack, and acknowledge your willingness to have me on this program and to speak on behalf of AMENA-Psy at this very, very, very difficult time. And such decisions are not easy ones. So right from the outset, I want to express to you my gratitude.
Well, thank you very much. And again, thank you for your bravery for talking about these issues and in many ways educating us who are privileged from the situation. And I love that you were also describing a broader community that is even beyond the Palestinian experience, how this is also drudging up issues for certain groups. But why don't you just share with me, some of your thoughts to what's going on with the conflict and the violence that's happening and how that's affecting the professional psychologists in the community?
Well, I mean, I think first to think about this effort to silence dissent against those who would raise awareness of Palestinian pain and suffering. I think it's very, very difficult because there are many people who feel that any criticism of the state of Israel is in and of itself anti-Semitism or the dehumanization of people simply because they are Jewish. And I would hope, and I'm going to make some assumptions here, that you and I, that all of us listening to this program, I hope and pray, would agree that such dehumanization of Jewish people is extremely dangerous. And sadly, we do not have to look very far back in history to see not only the horror and unspeakable, really, tragedy of the Holocaust in Europe, but also the centuries of pogroms, racism, mistreatment, violence, trauma, and displacement that European Jewish communities have experienced. And that in many ways, those centuries of racism, anti-Semitism, mistreatment, violence, trauma, in all the ways it played out, really paved the way for the systematic genocide that the Third Reich committed against European Jews. So Jewish people have suffered for centuries, even prior to the concerted efforts at extermination they experienced under the Nazis, solely because of their status as Europe's internal other. And they were not, quote unquote, normative, and seen as normative in terms of their religious and cultural identity. And they paid a huge, huge, huge price for that. And there's much literature that has unpacked the deleterious effects of this transgenerational trauma on Jewish people. And indeed, much of the work on complex trauma, so foundational to those like myself who specialize in trauma psychology, has been deeply influenced. I have a great, great debt that I owe to the amazing Jewish scholars and theorists who have really made meaning from their own multi-generational history of trauma and suffering, in part by sharing their insights with the rest of the world. And I'm very grateful. I'm not grateful for their suffering. How could I ever be? But I'm grateful for the meaning they've made from it. And so I'm in debt to so many wonderful scholars and who I would like to name, but also acknowledge that some psychologists would argue that the level of violence that we're seeing and have seen in Palestine and Gaza committed on behalf of the Israeli state may very well be reflective of the scale of this unprocessed transgenerational trauma. And I think as a trauma psychologist myself who specializes in complex trauma, I have to hold that. And I have to hold, again, my deep compassion for people who have suffered so greatly. So when I'm thinking very specifically about the important work done by both Jewish scholars, I also want to think about this history of, again, making meaning from this tremendous suffering, and those who have looked out to connect with others across divides based on their own experience of anti-Semitism and this tragic history. And we have lots of wonderful examples of folks who have made those connections with between, for example, Jewish and Palestinian activist communities, and who have sought really to build an understanding and heal and address the open wounds left by years of violence and dehumanization that has really marked both of their experiences. So many Jewish activists who have spoken up and are speaking up now, I should name, for Palestinians, again, have drawn on this experience. And we're very, very grateful within the MENA communities. And I don't want to speak on behalf of all Palestinians, but I can name that many Palestinians feel a lot of gratitude and appreciation for folks willing to stand up and be important allies. So I'm thinking about, just to give some historical examples, activists like the late great Palestinian intellectual Edward Said, who forged relationships with Israeli Jews, like the incredible and gifted musician and conductor Daniel Barenboim. And through their connections and shared efforts out of their trauma history, and not in spite of it, they've done some amazing things, especially around music. And I actually have a friend of mine who was part of their orchestra, so I got to learn a little bit about that on the back end. I also would include the work, and you might be familiar with Dr. Gabor Mate, who
Yes.
himself.
Yes,
Okay.
I've watched his interviews. Oh my gosh, so touching, so phenomenal.
He's incredible. I got to go see him in Vancouver, and it was like one of the highlights of my own professional career. And he himself is a Holocaust survivor and has talked about that and his own experience of trauma, because that's really his focus. And then I think about other Jewish intellectuals and activists, extraordinary individuals, incredible human beings who are devoted to ending the dehumanization of all people and truly working to heal trauma across the human community. And so many of the activists who are part of Jewish Voices for Peace, I'm thinking about folks like Norman Finkelstein, the late Joel Koval, whose work has been really important for me, both in my previous kind of academic career and now, Ella Shohat, Judith Butler, Avi Schleim. And these are just some examples I'm naming, but I think if folks are interested in kind of growing their knowledge, any of their books would be really, really, I think, wonderful to consult. And again, they've done this work at great risk to themselves and their own careers. So I want to acknowledge that and express my gratitude. But you did mention, in terms of thinking about MENA communities and our experiences around Palestine and suffering. And so I did want to say, as you are naming it, that MENA communities are really hurting right now. And people across the region and MENA diasporic communities are really suffering and in pain as we grieve and struggle alongside our Palestinian siblings. And I would say, again, nothing is 100%, but MENA folks generally hold Palestine very, very close. And I would argue that the pain we are witnessing in, all the videos and images we're seeing, and the suffering of our Palestinian siblings, is very visceral and very personal. And I think, even as I say that, I want to make sure I center the almost unimaginable pain that Palestinians in Gaza and across Palestine and suffering first and foremost, and then of course the suffering of Palestinians in diaspora. Just to give you an example, which sometimes I think these examples can be more illustrative, and this was a very hard one for me, is that I woke up one morning after, events have unfolded after October 7th and that tragic day. And one of our members shared over our listserv that nearly 30 members of their extended family had been killed in one day by Israeli bombs. And that, wow, what a message to wake up to. And just holding the reality of that, though it wasn't my family member. I'm not Palestinian, but I felt it. And this scale of loss is really unfathomable. And at AMENA-Psy, our hearts are broken, and the devastation that we feel over this level of violence committed against Palestinian bodies is something that's very difficult to really adequately express. So as we witness Palestinians fleeing, oftentimes on foot for their lives in search of safety, either in different locations within Gaza or beyond its borders, you spoke to the broader context for us and this history of displacement and seeking of refuge because home is no longer safe is one that resonates very deeply for many of us across the MENA region. And I know that given the historical context of colonialism, it's not only us as MENA folks. You know, unfortunately, the reality of colonialism and some of the nationalist uprisings that have grown up, you know, afterwards, it's very real for many people. And I think that's why a lot of BIPOC folks feel very, you know, this is very hitting them very close to home. And, you know, speaking specifically to MENA people, it is something that many of us have this experience of displacement, colonialism, violence, war, invasion is something, again, like I mentioned, that's very familiar. And so what's occurring in Palestine and what has been occurring for the last, you know, approximately 100 years predating the events and the tragedies of October 7th on both sides, for Israelis and for Palestinians, is something that feels very personal, not only because of the geopolitics at play around Israel and Palestine for the MENA communities at large and its implications for peoples of the regions as a whole, because geopolitics is real, but also because of the transgenerational trauma that MENA communities have undergone for many years. So again, just naming the tremendous displacement caused by political uprisings, war, violence, nationalist movements, and colonialism across the region. I'm thinking about events in Turkey and Armenia, most recently with regard to the tragedy in Artsakh. And also, I should share, I'm a mother of Armenian children. My children are part Armenian, and so that reality of the genocide is very, very real for my family. Obviously, events in Syria, Yemen, Iran, and Iraq, Algeria, Libya, Lebanon. This is not an exhausted list. And not to mention the war in Afghanistan and the massive displacement of Afghans who fanned out across the neighboring countries like Iran and Turkey. So the whole region is affected.
Yeah. First of all, thank you for elucidating just every single pocket in the community of the AMENA region is affected. And speaking as a AAPI individual, we're familiar with displacement, familiar with wars, familiar with colonization. And so I can see how many communities are struck by this just shared experience of generational trauma that is happening and unfolding in front of our eyes. And so thank you for naming all that. And while also centering the experience on the Palestinians. And it is difficult because we talked about, you know, the ultimate question is, well, what would, I guess, a MENA identity be framed? You know, how do we reframe the community's visibility? And it's very difficult to create that visibility and identity without the context of what is happening. It's unfortunate.
And I appreciate you turning to us back to that too, Jack, because that reality of displacement from one's homeland and is you're sharing your own, you know, your own community's history is very real. The idea of having this deep longing within one's chest for a place we may never have even visited to begin with, right? But it's there. It's there for Palestinians in a very deep way. It's there for other MENA communities. It's there different celebratory events, and it's there at the sad events. It's there in conversations, it's there in music, it's there in dancing, it's there in food. I mean, in all sorts of ways. And I think the question that you're really getting to is something that I do think I would also like to center. That, and I think this is something that also kind of returns to where we started in this conversation, and this, when you asked me the question, what I would like to add around, these really brave individuals within the Jewish communities who are stepping up as allies, BIPOC communities like yourself who have experiences with familial transgenerational trauma and displacement are stepping up. And it's something that I also really appreciate deeply from those within trauma psychology. And a lot of the most exciting and meaningful work for me, especially as I work with individuals, is this idea, again, that loss and trauma, as devastating and heartbreaking as it is, if we are hopefully through some sort of support, right, however that looks, able to get to that space of, it's not, oh, it's over and done with kind of thing, but meaning making from it. That to me is where the possibility for post-traumatic growth, as they say within our field, really emerges. And so even for those of us who've done the work and have devoted our lives to healing, our scars remain tender and they need frequent dressing and so much care. I really believe I have a vision for society in which, rather than centering, all these amazing accomplishments, we center vulnerability. How would that look? And I fully believe as a psychologist who specializes in complex trauma, especially as it pertains to the experience of displacement, our scars also are a constant reminder of who we are, where we have come from, what we have suffered. And in the best ways, I believe our scars can help us build a deep, deep well of compassion that holds all of humanity, space for all of humanity, regardless of difference within us. It holds this well of compassion for other suffering and pain. And alongside that, a steadfastness to stand by and uplift others as part of our own path to healing and post-traumatic growth. And all the research in the literature says that by giving, opening out to others, that's where that growth happens. So for me, I think about this a lot with regard to the statement that AMENA-Psy put out following the tragedies of October 7th. And one of the lines I appreciated most from that statement was one that one of our Palestinian members in leadership wrote, which reads, "We unequivocally assert that any loss of human life is a tragedy." That's really, for me, where it's all about. And I personally feel this really summed up our perspective as an organization. It's one of the reasons I'm so proud to be a member of this organization. And it represents a value set I feel very committed to practicing as a MENA psychologist, as I've stated before, as a practicing Muslim who really believes the sacred is everywhere and is within every single human being. And as a human being myself, I feel like this is something we all have to honor, that humanity, that common humanity. So as much as we stand for MENA communities and celebrate our rich cultural traditions and emotional and psychological culture and human experiences that emerge in all of us and shows up differently within all of us, we at AMENA-Psy also do this work as part of a broader effort to assert and uplift our humanity and relationship, and indeed as inseparable from all humanity. And that includes Jewish humanity, Israeli humanity, Black humanity, Asian and Pacific Islanders, Latinx folks, Native American humanity, European and white humanity, LGBTQ plus humanity. The list goes on, including all human beings. So in closing, and in stating this, I'm reminded of the Persian poet Sa'di, whose exquisite lines of poetry grace the hall of the United Nations building in New York. I've visited those and got to see them up on the wall. And as any good Persian and MENA person, in terms of centering the good, the rich aspects of our culture, not just the devastation, but the rich aspects, I could not end my time on your podcast without citing a few lines of poetry that I think really speak to this piece and speak to the heart of my own relationship to our field and why I just love psychology as a field. And my own relationship to activism and the universal humanity. So if you don't mind indulging me, I would
please,
just like
please share. We'd love to hear.
Thank you. This is by Sadi. The sons of Adam are members of one body, for they are made of one and the same nature. When fortune brings distress upon one member, the peace of all others is destroyed. O thou, who art careless of thy fellow's grief, it fits not thou shouldst bear the name of man. So those lines for me really speak to how our humanity is dependent upon our connection to the humanity and our fellow human beings.
Well, Dr. Khaghani, thank you so much for sharing that, as well as your perspective and just your advocacy and leadership in AMENA-Psy, as well as your willingness to speak to groups and organizations and being on this podcast. I do appreciate this. Do you have any other final thoughts?
Oh, well, again, I just want to thank you, Jack, for making this space for me. And, speaking on behalf of AMENA-Psy, I can't bring everybody who's in the organization here to this podcast, although I know many of them would be able to speak to these issues much better than I have or ever could. But I want to acknowledge all the hard work that our board members, our committee members, and speaking from the advocacy committee, my co-chair and my committee members has done, and the members themselves who are in the, working every day. And just thanking you and all of your guests who've contributed to your amazing programming. So I wanted to thank you for that. And I think just, I guess, final thought would be really that for folks to really continue to be curious and open and ask questions from their colleagues, get to know their students, get to know their clients, think critically about even the media that they're consuming, and to educate themselves. And really, I guess I would encourage people to really, if they can, get to spend some time and know people one-on-one, some different MENA individuals if they haven't had an opportunity to, and that maybe have felt that distance that's created through, unfortunately, some of the cultural representations and misinterpretations that have come through. I know this sounds very elementary, but I do feel that sadly, one of the things we realize as MENA psychologists is just how little is known about us and how much that is out there is so inaccurate. So we love allies, and there is a way to join our organization as allies. And the role of allies, especially at this really, really difficult time, is just so crucial. So we encourage folks to be willing to get educated, be curious, and to, stand up, as we are trying to do. And I feel
so much gratitude, so much appreciation to you and value, just I just value greatly what you're doing and the space you've given us. I value all of the different guests you've brought on. Of course, I am holding on to hope for a just end to the violence and really calling and hoping for a permanent ceasefire in Palestine, and hoping and praying for a way forward and a meaning making that opens us all up to a deeper well of compassion and deeper connection to our shared humanity. And I feel that you're doing that in all the work that you're doing, Jack. And so just again, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Well, Dr. Khaghani, your feedback really means a lot. Thank you. And I couldn't agree more, which is making a ceasefire permanent and just centering on the idea that, we are all here trying to recognize the importance of human life, and that affects everyone. And what I'm going to do is provide links and resources on the show notes so people can look at the AMENA-Psy statements, as well as how to be an ally in terms of a membership. I mean, I watched a lot of videos from AMENA-Psy's website, and it's just a fantastic resource. And so, again, Dr. Khaghani, thank you so much for your time, and thank you so much for your insights.
Thank you so much again. It's been my pleasure.
A huge thank you to our listeners. If you like what you've heard, please share and subscribe to our podcast, People of Color and Psychology. Other ways to support us include registering for continuing education courses or making a donation on the Multicultural Counseling Institute's website. We value your input and appreciate your continued support. You can send us an email, a message on LinkedIn, or send us a voice message on our website. Until next time, this is your host, Jack Sun.